A few months back, I signed up for a tree delivery service. It's sort of an online list that you put your name on, and if there's a tree service in the area taking a tree out, you can have the wood, or they'll dump the wood at your house. So in the description of what I wanted, I made it clear that I wanted hardwood and something that wasn't cut into short lengths for firewood. And I knew when I was signing up for this, I would forget about it. And that's exactly what happened. About 2 or 3 months later, I got a text out of the blue from someone saying they had a truckload of maple for me and they'd be around in about 30 minutes. So I said, okay. And the truck showed up and it was full of maple logs. And I had them dump it in our driveway. Now, at first, it seemed like I had a huge bonanza of maple, but on closer inspection, a lot of the tree looks like it had been pretty rotten, and it was pretty clear why they had taken the tree out. So I painted the ends with wax emulsion paint. It basically seals up the ends, and let them sit for a few days while I wondered what I was going to do with all this. And I looked through the pieces and tried to figure out what was worth trying to mill up into lumber and what was just going to end up not being worth anything. I started with the biggest piece, which was probably the part closest to the ground. And it was pretty hollow on the inside. Most of it had rotted away. Most of this piece was just going to become firewood. But there was one side that looked like there was something salvageable out of it. And there was a big cable running into the piece of the trunk. And at first I couldn't figure out where it went inside the tree, and I was afraid of hitting it with the saw. But I found it on the other side, so I think it must have run through the crotch of the tree at some point, and then the tree had grown around it. So this is the small section from the trunk that looked like it was usable. So I cut it into quadrants. So I get 2/4 of the trunk from this piece. And there was a lot of dirt inside the center part of the trunk. So I managed to get it into 2 pieces that were small enough for me to move. And I figured with these I would cut them up on the bandsaw in the shop. So I wanted to be able to get them from here around to the back where the shop is. I haven't done a whole lot of log rolling, and I figured out that you don't want to pull the log towards you. You want to push it away, as I almost got run over by this log. So the first day that I spent on these, I didn't actually do any milling with the chainsaw. I just sort of got the parts ready and figured out which parts would be lumber and which parts would be firewood. One of the ends of one of the longer pieces I cut off as it wasn't going to go through the mill very well, and it made the log too long for my ladder when doing the milling. So I cut off enough to make 2 bowl blanks out of that piece. So I cut that into a circle and mounted a faceplate. And from there I could do a rough turning of that piece. I really need to be finishing up all of the dried bowl blanks that I have instead of making more. But this is so much fun. It's really enjoyable cutting green wood. You can carve your shape really quickly. So I got the blank round on the outside and cut down to where I didn't have any bark. So I could take the faceplate off, then turn the blank around so that the inside of the bowl faces out now. And I can carve the inside of the bowl. This time lapse is making me want to figure out at exactly what speed the lathe will make the time lapse look like the bowl isn't turning. With this, I got really close, so the bowl looks like it's turning really slowly, but it's actually spinning quickly. It would be neat to see a time lapse where the bowl's being carved, but it doesn't look like it's turning. And I could put on the same wax paint to seal up the blank and let it dry. I got 2 bowls out of the piece that I cut off. Now I can finally get to the milling of the logs. This piece is kind of a mostly rotten piece. I'm trying to figure out which side I want to have as up and to be the first slab. And once I get that figured out, I can lift one end. What I wanted to do is to get one end higher than the other so that I can have gravity help move the chainsaw along as I slab the log. And once I have it lifted, I can put something underneath it. And it seems to be stable. Now I can put my ladder onto the log, and I'll use the ladder as a guide for the chainsaw, so the first cut will be nice and straight. It's always a little bit tricky getting the ladder attached, because you want it attached well with the screws, but you don't want the screws going so deep that you'll hit them with the chainsaw. And I cut up the mostly rotten section, and I loaded those pieces into the truck, and I drove those around to the back of the house, and I used them to make a raised bed. I'm figuring this is somewhat temporary. And I could run the first pass on the log, and that all went fine. And I can take the ladder off now. So now I have a flat surface to the log that I can use to make the slabs. So I don't need the ladder anymore. And I used the kid's wagon to move the slabs out of the way. And this all went pretty well. It looks like the higher end of the log has a little bit of rot in it, and the lower end is pretty solid. And the in-between part, there's some spalting going on. So I should be able to find some nice wood in this piece. Now, after I did some of the chainsaw milling, I brought those 2 pieces that I cut from the lower part of the trunk into the shop. And I cut those up on the bandsaw. And I started by trying to get one flat face. And once I had that, I could run that against the fence and basically slab these 2 pieces. So the shot looking towards the lathe is one of the pieces, and then the bigger piece is the shot from this direction. And it started out pretty hard because the pieces are heavy. In fact, I built 2 little legs for the table on the bandsaw, which probably weren't necessary, but I really didn't want to break the table on the bandsaw. Then once the piece got smaller, it got easier and easier to cut and move. So this is the bigger piece. And this blade I haven't sharpened since before I did the dining room table, and I cut up the big glulam beams. So it's actually doing really well for being used on so much. So the pieces in the foreground are what I cut up. Now I can do the next log, and this was another day, or morning I guess. and I can lift one end up and do the same thing, trying to get the log at an angle. And I can attach the ladder again. I wondered about doing this first cut on all 3 of the logs first, and then doing all the slabbing, so I wouldn't have to adjust the guide on the chainsaw. But I ended up just doing them separately on separate days. I didn't want to have that first cut exposed to the sunlight for a few days while I got to that log, as it might start to crack. So I can slab this log. Now there was a spot in this log where there was a bunch of dirt. It looks like it was sort of a little mini crotch in the tree. So I cleaned that out as best I could. And on inspecting the cut, it looked like there was a little bit of twist. I think this comes from doing this myself and trying to hold the saw on the ladder perfectly straight as it goes all the way down the log. So I got out my little planer and tried to carve off a little bit of the high spot on the cut. And that seemed like it helped. It was definitely better. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be flat. If I left that twist in the first cut, it would copy itself all the way down through the log into each of the slabs. So if I fix it on the first one, then the rest of the cut should be nice and flat. I think I got 3 slabs out of that log. Then the final piece was a shorter log, but a bigger diameter. So I cut that. It always feels like you're just slabbing the whole time. Like you cut one, you pull it off, you cut another one, you pull it off, you cut another one. But actually there's all this other stuff that happens between each of the slabs. You have to clean up the sawdust, you have to make sure the saw is filled with all of its fluids, keep the chain sharp. So there's actually, you may do a slab in 6-7 minutes, but then there's 15 or 20 minutes of screwing around with the saw and the slabs and the cleanup and keeping everything running. Now I was getting down to the end of the little log and it fell off my supports. It was all fine, it just meant that getting that slab finished took a little bit. Then I re-supported that last piece of the log so I could do the last slab. And at this point I was getting to the very end of my mix of gas and I didn't want to make a new batch. So I really wanted to finish without running out of gas. But I did. It was fine. Now I found a nice spot in our carport to stack everything. And my only little concern is that it's in the sun. I was hoping the apple trees that are right behind it will help shade it enough, but it may not. So at some point I may need to move this pile, which I really don't want to do. I put the end slab on the top, and that'll keep it protected, and it'll help weight everything down to keep it flat. So from the big truckload of wood that showed up, this is what I got out of it. Plus the 2 bowl blanks that I got, and the edge around the garden, and about 2, maybe 3 yard debris containers of sawdust. Thanks for watching.